So we're up to 12. We've gone through 11 chapters, and I've heard different comments with regard to confusion level or different thoughts, perceived thoughts versus the reality, and so it's interesting to get people's feedback. We looked at chapter 11, and keep in mind, I think I mentioned of this last week that there comes a point as we're progressing through these different judgments. We went through the seals and then the trumpets, and we're in sort of this lull period where there's a break, and now John is giving us context. And we're going to see more of that as we look at 12, 13, and 14. And some of that I'll mention in a minute. It takes a different frame of mind because Eastern literature is different than what we're used to. And so when we understand that, it begins to give us a better understanding. And so chapter 11 saw the blowing of the last trumpet, the seventh trumpet, and this is where people begin to get excited because Jesus is going to take up the reins of leadership, and the judgment has begun. And so there's a lot going on. There's been a lot of misery. There's been a lot of pain. There's been a lot of war. There's been a lot of famine, a lot of death, a lot of things that are going on. And we're in this middle period of the tribulation. And so as we have seen in the past, there's sometimes where we have a break. And we said last week that break between judgments is where God is demonstrating his mercy, giving people an opportunity to make the choice to accept him. He doesn't want to, he knows these next judgments are going to unfold. He knows how difficult they're going to be. He knows people are going to die, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he's providing opportunities even as we go through these judgments for people to reach out and to accept him. And yet we see that there's still people who won't, and they double down on their idols and on all that is evil and contrary to what God is and what he wants. So now we're going to get to this chapter 12 and understand that Eastern literature is different in that it doesn't always follow this linear progression. That now we're going to see John do something that is unusual to us in our understanding of literature. He's going to kind of circle back to the beginning of time and try to remake the case for what God is doing. And ultimately, at the end of this, what we're going to see is chapter 12 is just a summation of God's plan of redemption. But he's going to go back all the way to Genesis in order to give us context so that we understand that, so that it begins to make sense to us. And we're going to see two primary characters. Well, actually, I probably should say three characters. We're going to see the woman, we're going to see the dragon, and then we're going to see this child. And so hopefully by the end of this, we'll have a better understanding of what John is trying to help us to understand. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6, and then we'll kind of go through those before we progress to the other verses. It starts in verse 12 and verse 1 saying that a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. And she was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. And then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, and so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now, this chapter 12, gets a lot of attention from a lot of different people, and they try to assign this woman to a particular idea or person. Probably the most notable are those in Catholicism who proclaim that this woman is the Virgin Mary. Now, we know ultimately that that is not the case, but when you look at paintings of Mary or you look at statues, a lot of times these statues depict Mary with a crown of 12 stars, clothed with the sun and standing on the moon. This is where they get that from. The problem is Scripture doesn't support that this could be Mary. Other people will say that that this is exclusive to the contemporary church. Again, I don't think that there's Scripture that validates that, but as we get a little bit further along, we can see some parallels between who this woman really represents and the church today. And so the first thing that's important to understand, this is not a person per se. John starts off in the very first verse and he says, it's a great sign. And so what we have to decide is, what is it a sign of? It says that this sign is pregnant. It's clothed with the sun. She has the moon under her feet. She's wearing a crown of 12 stars. Now, I mentioned that in Eastern literature, what happens a lot of times is that we go full circle. We're going back in time. And in this case, we're going all the way back to Genesis 37. Now, you know that in this chapter, we have Joseph. Joseph is the son of Jacob, who's the youngest son. He is sort of the favorite child. He is the one who has these dreams, and he has this need to tell his brothers and others about his dreams. His brothers aren't particularly fond of him. Ultimately, we know that they save him or sell him into slavery. But there's one particular dream when Joseph was young, in chapter 37, verse 9, it says, I had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. He said, listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. And so ultimately, if you go back and you study Joseph's life and all that took place there, Joseph is saying that he and his family are going to bow down to him. And we know, because of history, because of the Bible, because of other archaeology, that Joseph, after he was sold into slavery, he ends up ascending the ranks in Egypt. He becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. And as a result of his politics and his leadership, when the rest of the world, if you will, is experiencing famine, he's saving up for the famine. He's saving up crops. And we know that eventually his someone come in? Okay. His brothers are going to come back because they are starving in the land. And they come down to Egypt, and Joseph is going to essentially save them because he's going to be able to provide food for them. And so ultimately what had been prophesied in a dream years before, where Joseph says that his family is going to bow down to them, it came to fruition. And so now what John is seeing many, many years later, thousands of years later, is that this woman who is clothed with the sun, that is representative of Jacob, the father. So we got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who ultimately is Jacob is Israel. So clothed with the sun, that's representative of Jacob. Standing on the moon, that's representative of Rachel. The 12 stars in the crown, those are representative of the sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel. And each one of those are the tribes that make up the collective of Israel. And so this woman that John sees is not, in fact, a woman, but it is a representation of the nation of Israel. Now, the woman who is pregnant and gives birth, she gives birth to a male son. That male son, anybody want to guess who that is? Not everybody at once. That is the Messiah. We know that Jesus comes through the line of David. He's part of that lineage. And ultimately, that is what John is seeing, is the nation of Israel who gives birth to the Messiah. Now, eventually we will see, because because of Christ's death on the cross, there is this coming together. There's of the nation of Israel and the Gentile world, meaning that there's God's family. You're either in God's family or you're not. But also there's going to be a history that needs to play out with the nation of Israel. And so this is specific to the nation of Israel. Now, it's important to understand too that that this starts with Abraham. And Abraham was a Gentile. There was no such thing as a Jew. All this began with a pagan person, Abraham, whom God says, I'm going to build a great nation through you. And as a result of that, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the lineage of the family, that is what becomes, that's when we start using the terminology Jew. It probably actually began when they were in captivity, and it was short to describe the people from Judah. That's where the word Jew comes from. So that's who the woman is. Now we also have this other person or thing to deal with. This is this enormous red dragon. So he's red, and we aren't positive about the reasoning for the descriptor of the dragon being red, but this is also a color that is linked with symbolically extraordinary power as well as evil. He has 7 heads. It's multiple heads, 10 horns. Now, horns were symbolic of great strength and authority. So when you have multiple horns, this is exponential strength. And so this is something or someone who is very powerful. If you went back to Daniel chapter 7, you would see Daniel's prophecy talking about this dragon. He has 7 crowns, which simply means he is royalty. He's got power, government authority. He's very strong. And then it says his tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of heaven. These are essentially angels who were in heaven with Satan, who rebelled against God. And so we don't know how many there are, if there's hundreds, thousands, millions. The Bible doesn't tell us how many. We just know there's a lot of them. And when they were cast out of heaven, Satan and Satan's army, the other angels, the demons, that is what makes up that which is evil. So symbolically, this dragon is representative of Satan. If you go and want to look at verse 9 and 10, it actually identifies or gives 5 different names to Satan. Now, many people have taken the fact that there are multiple heads and multiple horns, and they've kind of run with it. And they try to equate this to a revised Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the last true empire that really had world authority. And so people say, well, this is trying to represent that's going to come back, that there's going to be a revisiting or revitalization of the Roman Empire. I don't think that there's any scripture that really supports that. I think what John is trying to help us to understand is that this is a way of describing this supernatural evil that is going to rear its head and be in control. And it's so extraordinary. It's beyond comprehension how powerful and wicked Satan and his demons can be. And so what is the dragon doing? It says in verse 4 that the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, and so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Again, so this male child is Jesus. We know that a scepter is symbolic of someone who's in authority, a ruler, a king holds a scepter. And so the nation of Israel, depicted by this pregnant woman, is going to give birth to the Messiah. This Messiah is going to rule all the nations one day with an iron scepter. And we see Satan, the dragon, standing there over the woman, waiting for her to give birth so that he can devour this child. He wants to stop the Messiah from ruling. And so the nation of Israel, it says, it says the woman's child, which is Jesus, is snatched up. And that is representative of the resurrection, when Jesus was raised from the dead. And then ultimately, God brings him back into heaven. He ascends to heaven and he sits at the right throne, right hand of God. We also need to understand, why does the woman go into the desert? And the desert is symbolic for the nation of Israel of the place where God provides provision and fellowship and protection. And so it says 1,260 days the woman is in the desert, meaning 1,260 days the nation of Israel is seeking protection in the desert. So you have to remember, we're halfway through the tribulation period. This is what is going to take place. The Antichrist has come on the scene. He has gained favor with everybody in the world, including the nation of Israel. The temple is being rebuilt, but then something horrible happens. You remember we talked about the desolation, the abomination of desolation. That is where the Antichrist goes into the temple. He builds an idol of himself and he declares that he is God. That's when the nation of the people who are on his side realize that he isn't really a friend of the Jews. And so they say, this really isn't the Messiah. And they flee Israel into the desert to get away from the Antichrist. And in John's vision, what we're seeing is that the nation of Israel, once they realize who the Antichrist is, they're going to flee. God is going to protect them. He's going to protect them for 1,260 days, which just happens to be 42 months or 3.5 years, the second half of the tribulation period. So now, after we see that, John wants to give us more context for what's taking place. And he wants us to understand the discord, the rebellion that was taking place in heaven. And so we go to verses 7 to 17. It says, then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, the ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Verse 10. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power of the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuse them before our God day and night has been hurled down. They, meaning the saints, the believers, triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. They are people who decided to stand and fight for Christ and with Christ. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you will dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman. Again, the woman is Israel and ultimately the church. He pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child, Jesus. The woman was given the two wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times and a half a time, out of the serpent's reach. And then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and swept her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, that's the church, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. And so this fall from heaven, if you have time, this is it's talked about symbolically in Isaiah in chapter 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28. Understand that we don't really know when Satan was in this big battle. It was Satan or Lucifer with his angels against Michael and all the good angels. Clearly, Satan lost, and so they're cast out of heaven. Now, chronologically, all we can know for sure is this happened sometime prior to Satan appearing in the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve. When, again, we don't know for sure. But so what has happened here is that John is showing us, again, more context. He's showing us who this dragon is, Satan is, and he's helping us to understand what took place to lead us to where we are today. Back in heaven, in eternity past, something happened that caused Lucifer, Satan, to rebel against God. Perhaps he knew what God's plan was already from the beginning of time. He knew about the plan of redemption, but they have this conflict. There is this animosity between them. God casts them out. Now that Satan is cast out and knows that he can't win over God, the next thing that he wants to do, the next best thing, is to attack the nation of Israel. And ultimately, we know that God protects the nation of Israel. And so if he can't win with the nation of Israel, he's come against it, he's hurt it in a lot of ways. But the next hope for him is to destroy the child of the nation of Israel, the Messiah, Jesus, who's going to be birthed out of the nation of Israel. Well, when that failed, the next best thing, Jesus is now in heaven, sitting next to the Father. And so the next thing left for Satan to do, because he knows he's on limited time, is to attack God's people. He can continue to attack the nation of Israel here on earth, and he can continue to attack all the people who ultimately are going to be part of the family of God, you and me and those who will come into a relationship with him at some point in the future. And so that's what Satan realizes. That's the best that he has. And so that is the period of time that is taking place that where we are in chapter 12 with regard to the tribulation period. And so chapter 12, if you look at it collectively, is really just an affirmation of God's plan of redemption. The plan was put into place in eternity past, like I mentioned, in heaven. There's this rebellion among the angels led by Lucifer, the two generals, Lucifer and Michael. Michael wins. Satan is cast out. Satan and those angels that rebelled, that becomes the demons that are very real that live on earth. God had identified from long time past that Abraham, excuse me, who was a Gentile, was going to be the one to birth this new nation. And we know Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob becomes the father of Joseph. Joseph, because of his role in Egypt, is able to save the 12 tribes who become the 12 tribes of Israel. Satan decides that he's going to destroy the nation of Israel. He's tried, he's failed, he continues to fail. And God's plan continues to unfold. The Messiah comes. Jesus conquers death and sin through his sacrifice on the cross. He overcomes the grave, being raised from the dead. He tells the church, his disciples, before he ascends to heaven, look, there's going to become a time where all of this is going to end. Again, if you go back and look at Matthew 24, he knows, he's explaining there's going to be this tribulation period. There's going to be a time where everything comes to a head, and the church is going to be in a precarious situation. You're going to have to continue to fight, continue to remain faithful, because Satan is going to come against you. But do not worry, Satan will not prevail if you remain vigilant and you remain committed to him. And so that's a lot to try to get our minds around, I think. As I'm sure many people are aware that there are people who try and super spiritualize this chapter as well as other chapters, and they try to, again, it goes back to this whole idea of trying to predict when when Christ is going to come back. And so we assign all sorts of different points of history to this chapter. And what we have seen historically is people get it wrong over and over and over again. And when they get it wrong, they just come up with a new scenario. We can't make this into something that it's not. Remember, we need to look at the literature and the scripture the way that it was written for the original readers of the scripture. And when you follow the scripture, there's a lot of people will read commentaries on the Bible, and that's okay, but there's no greater commentary on the Bible than the Bible. And so we need to rely on what scriptures say about itself. And so I think that honest research, honest assessment, honest study will show that this woman is the nation of Israel. The dragon is obviously Satan, because it says it's Satan. And his goal is to eliminate the nation of Israel in order to eliminate the Messiah. When that doesn't work, he's going to just take as many people out as he possibly can. And so whether that period is now or 1,000 years from now, it doesn't really matter. The plan is the same. It doesn't change God's redemptive plan, and it shouldn't change our response to his plan. The only answer to this is to continue to share the gospel with people so that they can escape the one who prowls around like a roaring lion, referring to Satan, because it is Satan who is going to keep us from God.